So this is a recording for the Hidden Histories Women of Waterloo programme. And we're joined today by Steve Martin, who is a museums and heritage consultant and also an author, and Professor Jennine Hurl-Eamon, who is from Trent University in Canada. And they're going to be giving us the benefit of a lot of their experience in research. So could you tell us a bit more about your work, Steve?
Okay, so my work is with heritage organizations, museums, but it's largely focuses on archives, collections, access to archives, and with a particular focus on the multi-ethnic peopling of the British Isles, and also far too much maritime history. But it's an obsession, and it's not going to stop anytime soon.
We can't really argue about obsessions here. We're very much Waterloo obsessed, so we feel it. And Jennine.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm a history professor at Trent, and I've written a number of books, but my latest book was on marriage and the British Army in the long 18th century. And currently I'm completing another book, a fourth book, on childhood and the wars of the long 18th century. So, and when I say long 18th century, I go up to Waterloo. So I've been really interested in this period, and particularly because there's such rich primary sources. There's a lot of memoirs that were written not too long after the Napoleonic Wars that really help to tell us about how common soldiers and their families experienced the wars.
So Sarah and I were wondering if you could both give us a bit of basic context to the peninsula and Waterloo, because I think it's fair to say for a lot of people, if you say Waterloo, even in Britain, they'll just be like, what do you mean, the station in London? Not everybody knows much about it at all. And so we're hoping for you guys to give us a bit of a guided tour for the period, really. So if you were there at the time, what you might be able to see, hear and taste and touch and smell. And so we were wondering whether you might have like a favourite image or painting from the era that we could share with our group, and share with everybody here, and just give a bit more context to the era.
Well, for me, my favourite image, or the most redolent image, is one from 1822, and it's David Wilkie's painting of Chelsea pensioners reading the Waterloo Dispatch. And it's an incredibly densely, in human terms, very densely populated image of a number of veterans, many of them visibly Chelsea pensioners, you can tell by the red coats, who are hearing the news of the victory at Waterloo. And prominent amongst them, almost at the human center of the tableau, is a black pensioner, very young looking black pensioner, I have to say, but he's smiling with joy as the news is being read out by one of the literate veterans, and his presence just points us to the complexity of origins of some of the soldiers at Waterloo, and also to the fortunate position that many of the veterans are in, to actually have pensions, whether as in or out pensioners. So it immediately sets us into thinking about the fates of some of these individuals, and that what we're looking at is a snapshot, a very artful snapshot of some of the lucky ones, and it prompts consideration about those who didn't make it into the image.
I've always liked Thomas Rowlandson's etching of Soldiers on a March. It's called Soldiers on a March, and at the bottom of it, when it was circulated broadly in print, it said, "Pack up your tatters and follow the drum." And it's really about army wives. And a lot of historians have interpreted it as a celebration of army wives because it shows a row of soldiers and women and children fording a stream, crossing a stream, the women are lifting their skirts really high to cross the stream, much higher actually than is necessary for the depth of the water. But so a lot of historians have seen it as, showing the heroism of these women because it's, they're walking and they're lugging a whole bunch of stuff and they're bravely, following the men to war. But the reality is that I suspect this was more of a satire. It was more a commentary on the inappropriateness of women and children with soldiers in war. You can see when you look closely at the image, the soldiers are bent with the weight of all of this domestic paraphernalia. So they have big kettles and they have a lot of children on their backs. And some of, at least one of the soldiers is carrying a large woman on his back. And also if you look to the far side of the picture, you can see an officer who is riding on the shoulders of one of the women. And this, I think, is a not so subtle suggestion that an officer who allows women and children to accompany the troops on campaign is himself effeminate, not a warrior type of masculinity. So I think that image is very, helpful in giving us a bit of a sense of what it might be like to travel with the army, but also what popular perceptions were of camp following women.
Where was the peninsula? What do we talk about? What do we mean when we talk about the peninsula?
Yeah, if I can field that, I would say we're talking about the Iberian Peninsula, so Portugal and Spain. And usually these women and children would have left one of the ports in Ireland or England, and they would have traveled, possibly roughly 10 days in this sea voyage to get to Lisbon is where they would usually arrive. And then they would be the Peninsular War. They were at various times, at various points in Portugal and in Spain, and they were driven back several times by, and I say they, meaning the regiments and then the camp following women who were there with them, driven back. At one point, I think it's 1808, they were driven all the way back to the port of Corunna and had to go back to England because the French army was pressing so hard. And then eventually, as we know, they did push the French back and they went across the Pyrenees and into France. So when we talk about the Peninsular War, that's really what we're talking about, Spain and Portugal.
Can either of you pick out like a sensual detail from this period, whether that might be from the image that you've been speaking about, or whether it's just from your research in general? If you were one of these women, or indeed one of those children, can you think of something that you would be able to hear or taste or touch, something that you would be able to smell or see, something just to sort of set the scene with a few physical details?
I love this question. So I'm like, I think that's such a fascinating question when we think about the sights, the sounds, the smells that people would have experienced in these conditions in this period. So, you can imagine that for many common people, travel was quite limited. So to be in the Army or the Navy, there were great opportunities for to see, hear, smell, and taste very different things. And this is something I think our own current culture really enjoys and appreciates. So there's like there's a lot, most of us really enjoy travel. And so in the 18th and 19th century, this was something that regular people didn't have very many opportunities to do. So when you arrive in a place like Portugal, one of the things that we see in the accounts from soldiers is the very different smells of food, because they cooked with garlic and oil and onions to a much greater degree than they had in Britain. And they talk about and of course, unlike foodies today, they were actually put off by these foreign smells and tastes. And they were very critical of the Portuguese and their charcoal fires and their smelly garlic. And so that's certainly one thing that comes uppermost to my mind.
I think that's great. It's really useful to have that sort of insight into a new period. It just sort of helps us feel like we could be there ourselves sometimes, doesn't it, to think about those kinds of details.
I really love your choices of image, because Steve's image, yours is more sort of what London would have been like at the time of the battle. And then Jennine, you're kind of, obviously, as you've mentioned, your image is a satire, but it does start to get us thinking about what the experience in the Peninsula and Waterloo would have been like. So Steve, thinking about your image, it opens up that window into what the London of the period of the Peninsula and Waterloo was like. Sort of who would you have met if you were in London at that time?
Oh, this is a huge question, and the answer correspondingly so. But you would have met a broad cross-section of humanity for obvious reasons. Since the Tudor period, and bit by bit, but explosively throughout the 18th century, you had populations from all parts of the globe, some being brought here willingly, and others unwillingly. And we're talking about a cross-section, extraordinary cross-section of people, particularly when you're looking at people from the African diaspora, people who are being generationally born here from the mid-1700s at least, people who are comparatively wealthy, who are also living here from various sources of income, and a huge number who are genuinely dispossessed. They are members of the underclass, they are part of the great working poor, and several of whom end up in the British Army as their only option of survival. And indeed, a surprising number of whom choose to re-enlist after their period of service is over, because that is one way of securing a future for themselves and their families. So it's a really interesting picture at this time, because you have to remember it's 8 years after the transportation of human lives for sale across the Atlantic. The first abolition bill has passed. You have a London where amongst this diverse Black population, there is some involvement in these new radical organizations and meetings which are starting up. You've got publication, The Axe Laid to the Root by Robert Wedderburn, which is being printed in Tottenham Court Road, extremely radical, both in terms of being anti-slavery and basically anti-everything, anti-religion, anti-monarchy. It's a great read. But I point to it just to establish the fact of the unexpected. There's no one story that suits all of these individuals, but the fate of many of those who entered the armed forces is depressingly similar.
What sorts of roles would we have seen Black people enlisting in?
Okay, so again, you had people from a number of backgrounds who are enlisting, usually willingly. For example, you have people who had formerly been enslaved, like George Rose, who went on to become a sergeant in the Black Watch after having been at Waterloo with the 73rd Regiment of Foot. So in common with the Royal Navy, on occasion, the British Army was quite willing to accept people who were runaways, people who were fleeing enslavement. In fact, throughout the 1790s, with the formation of the West India regiments, the British Army was actually buying batch lots of black men, of African men, to wear the King's red and carry a musket. So there was that direct entry route, but more often it was out of desperation, particularly for members of the black community that were resident in the British Isles. And the roles were strange as well, because it was a double-edged. There's on one side it was cosmetic. There was a cosmetic element to having black soldiers in these regiments. They were most often employed as musicians and bandsmen, but equally they had to go to war, and they would, be found, and particularly the trumpeters and drummers would be around the colours. They'd be in charge of the signalling or putting out the signals, and they'd be taking fire. They were very, very prominent on the battlefield. So you also see a bizarre incident where you ask how they were treated. We have to assume that in a boys' club like the Army and the British Army of late 18th, early 19th century, it would have been astonishingly, just unspeakably, hellishly rough. But there's a couple of interesting cases, such as that of the 29th Regiment of Foot, which was often avoided by many white men who wanted to enlist, because they actually kept to the rule book of having the floggings administered by the drummers. And the drummers were all black. So there was a lot of discussion and unease and revulsion, actually, at the time, of having black drummers flogging, administering, awarding lashes to white personnel. But I just threw that in by way of illustrating how multiple the roles were, and even more so in the Royal Navy. I don't think there's enough time for that, but again, you had people from the rank of landsmen, the lowest entry rank, to, bizarrely, the captain of a frigate, two frigates, the Arab and the Tartar, Captain John Perkins, who had started life as an enslaved person. So the Navy is genuinely odd and bizarre. But as I said, my earliest, my opening statements, a lot of the fates of so many of the black soldiers who were at Waterloo, they are of a depressing and similar pattern.
So, Jennine, thinking about your image, what was the attitude towards the camp followers, especially from the Army's point of view?
They had some use for women, particularly as nurses, laundresses, and cooks to some degree, but they had only limited use for them. So the Army really wasn't keen, and I alluded to this in discussing Rawlinson's image, because a lot of women with the troops would seem like it was not, it was a burden, and it was not pursuing military goals as effectively as if those women had stayed behind. So the Army officially, by this period, by the time of the Peninsular War and Waterloo, they generally had a rule that only 12 women per company, only 6 women per company of 100 men could travel with the regiment in an official capacity. And so in an official capacity, that meant that they were entitled to a half share of a normal soldier's rations. And so they, in return for receiving rations, they would be conducting the duties that the regiment might have needed, so laundering, nursing, etc. But in a lot of the officers weren't very well disposed towards women, the women that the soldiers brought with them. And so there are, you can see letters from officers complaining about them, calling them names. And if they were caught doing anything that was deemed problematic by an officer, like they would also run settling tents and sell alcohol to the troops, and cigars and various things like that. If they fell afoul of an officer, they could be drummed out of the regiment and basically left behind in a foreign land with no real recourse.
So we're in the age of sail, but how are these people physically traveling? How are they physically getting from their situation in Ireland or England to Portugal?
This was something I found really interesting in my research for my book on childhood and war, because the army didn't want women to travel with women who were pregnant or had young children. They didn't want them for obvious reasons. But of course, what happens is that women often who are traveling with their husbands, they fall pregnant while they are on the march. And so it's very interesting to see what sort of efforts were made to assist pregnant women, women with young children, toddlers to travel with the army. Even on ships, it's really very interesting because you can imagine these large sailing vessels. It's not easy to load women and children onto a large ship. So there's interesting accounts of having to take them in contraptions and swing them across, or take them out in very rickety boats, because you'd have to leave the port and the shallower water and still make it out to a deep sea vessel. But then once they got to land, just to go back to your question, Katy, once they got to land, they were there. Occasionally they might travel by smaller vessel on the river, like the Tagus River from Lisbon, but often they were traveling on foot. And occasionally they might have access to donkeys or to a seat in the baggage cart. But it was something where when things got really tough, as in retreat situations, they were cast out of the baggage carts. These were exclusively for wounded soldiers or baggage. And so there were some horrific stories of what it was like for women and children to travel. They were often, denied any assistance, and the women still continued to carry their children to, even when they could barely drag themselves forward with a retreating regiment, they would still hold on to their children. And the soldiers really wrote admiringly of the maternal devotion of these women. But the conditions of travel were very, very hard, and they were often barefoot as well, as soldiers were too. So
what would the alternate be? So say you have not been chosen to follow your husband, or you have left the army or the navy, Steve. What would your prospects be like afterwards? What's the alternative? Why would people say sign up for another term of service? Should we go to you first, Jennine?
Sure. So, so as I said before, there were only a few women that would be selected to travel on the strength of the regiment. And there were a number of other women. We don't know, because the army kept terrible records in this period of women at all. Even the official women, we don't have many records of. But there were many women, probably unofficially, who also followed the regiment, and the army kept trying to put them off. But those who weren't able to follow, or possibly chose not to follow, often they had very challenging existences as women who were married or who had a partner but were living apart from that partner. They're very vulnerable in British society at this time. And these are usually the type of women who would marry into the ranks of the army were usually not, they didn't have a lot of family or, helpful connections in their communities. Often these are more marginalized women that the soldiers would court, and they would fall prey to the soldiers' advances and either marry them or follow them. So these are women who were very vulnerable then in that soldier's absence. And particularly, you can imagine if you are pregnant or you have a young child and you have no partner. It really came home to me as a mother. The stage in life when your children are very young is one where you're both physically and economically, it's very difficult without a partner to survive well. So in this period, it was even more difficult because there is a sort of social safety net in this period. There's a very kind of crude welfare system called the poor relief system, but it was targeted to a specific group of the population. You weren't eligible for poor relief unless you had lived in the parish for a certain amount of time or worked or paid rent in a parish for a certain amount of time. That qualified you to have a settlement in that parish. And a lot of soldiers were Irish, or their wives were Irish, and the parish relief system didn't exist for Irish people. So that's a challenge. And possibly even if you were English or Welsh, you still didn't have a settlement for the reasons that, you hadn't worked or lived in a parish for a sufficient amount of time. So then, because there is this parish relief system, begging is actually illegal. And you can be labeled a vagrant, which is a crime, and you can be whipped and incarcerated. So there's not a lot of options for these women. And a lot of the women who were left behind, we can assume, became so desperate that they turned to things like prostitution to survive. So it's quite, and the officers who are denying them the ability to remain with the troops, they are of a class that really has no sense of the realities of life for people, particularly women at this, who are this poor and desperate. So it's really a scary and sad story for women who were not able to stay with their husbands. Not much better if you were able to stay with your husband, but.
Yeah, I can only carry that baton of grimness from you, Jennine, when looking at the fortunes of some of the families, and the individual fortunes as well as family fortunes of some of the Black veterans, going back to the 1770s, 80s, and 90s. London had been awash with Black beggars, a huge number of whom had been veterans of the land-based campaigns in North America and veterans of the Royal Navy. But after Waterloo, you have, I don't want to say varying fates because they're uniformly grim, but there are frequencies of grimness. People who seem to do okay, the more settled members, as you're saying, people who could satisfy the examinations as to get accessing poor relief, people like George Rose, who after Waterloo, he re-enlisted, he into the Black Watch, moved to obviously Scotland, and became a Methodist minister, and he married, had a family, and he was living in comparative comfort again, here's someone who was literate, someone who was well known, apparently popular. He had that sort of charisma and social mobility, which could afford him all sorts of things which wouldn't have been available to someone like, say, John Bishop, who had served with the 69th Regiment of Foot, and after Waterloo just seemingly vanished. We believe that he married, which makes the circumstances under which he re-enters history really quite depressing, because he is found in 1844 begging on the streets of Bristol, and he is literally barefoot and wearing rags, and he's only recognizable by the glint of his Waterloo medal, which is sort of worn down at the back. But yeah, there are all sorts of very, very strange and predictable outcomes, including William Affleck, who was with the 10th Dragoons at Waterloo. And even though he was married, he did have a family. Even though he could satisfy for poor relief, the examination for poor relief, and he was also an out pensioner at Chelsea. But even his family went through terrible times in great poverty, extraordinary poverty. And yeah, so that just seems to be a pattern. There seems to be there are, apart from maybe, no, I was thinking of Ukasor Groniosor from earlier decades, who had been with the 73rd, and he'd actually been in the army and the navy. But he left us an account published 1773 of his life, his experiences, was basically compiled for him. But it was, again, a descent into hell, where the family ends up going from Colchester to Kidderminster, pillar to post, eating carrots and being thankful and grateful and living lives of Christian rectitude and near starvation throughout the Midlands in the end of the 18th century. But there are very, very few positive stories or great takeaways.
How common was literacy at this time, and particularly literacy in the two groups of people that we're talking about, the Black community and the women who were following the drum?
Something very interesting is happening during this period, which is the phenomenon of Black thought, African thought in the English language, for being produced, printed, disseminated for a majority white British readership. Many of the Black writers, a slew of them, who appear throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Olaudah Equiano, Robert Wedderburn, John Gia, John Morant, Britton Hammond, many of them have had that experience of having been either to sea or served in the British Army in one capacity or other. They've traveled, they've had an aspected appreciation of life and through the horrors of military service, and they have lived and worked and fought beside and amongst Europeans, which changes everything. It's a great, it tends to level, even temporarily, it levels experiences. And out of many of these experiences, you do have, as I say, that first massive slew of writers. I'd also include Phyllis Wheatley and later on Mary Prince. But this is happening at the same time as you have publications such as The Axe Laid to the Root, The Forlorn Hope, which are being printed and disseminated by Robert Wedderburn, the Jamaican radical of central London, which isn't to detract from the fact that the majority of people of African origin would not have been literate. They wouldn't have been people like Ignatius Sancho, who was a property owner, a voter, a happy family man, and perfectly bourgeois in every sense apart from his appearance. These were real outliers. The vast majority of people of African origin would have had that sort of semi-stunned, gawping expression that the black musician has in Wilkie's painting of the Chelsea pensioners hearing the news from Waterloo. It was still a hurdle that had to be overcome.
I would say the same of the women camp followers. First of all, it's actually quite challenging to determine levels of literacy with any certainty, but it's a safe assumption that most of them probably could not, because female literacy rates were lower than male, and of course the poor cohort from which common soldiers and camp followers are drawn, they had generally poor levels of literacy as well. But I would say that by the period of the Peninsular War and Waterloo, the army was actually a surprisingly early adopter of sort of publicly funded education. So there were regimental schools by this period. And the commander-in-chief of the army, the Duke of York, was a big advocate of formalizing regimental schools across the army. So there were opportunities for soldiers to learn to read, and those opportunities were often extended to their children. And I would suspect to women as well, though it's, again, very challenging to determine that. So, but yeah, so probably most of them could not read, but there is some evidence that some women came out of I should say, there's one woman that I found who came out of the wars as a camp follower, who appears to have been illiterate prior and was literate afterwards and ran a dame school.
I think that sort of leads us on to one of the other questions that we wanted to ask, just thinking about the idea of literacy. One of the things that Sarah and I found when we started researching this programme was that the sort of received wisdom about Waterloo and the Peninsula and the camp followers was that there are no very few first-hand accounts of this period written by those camp followers. And it's quite interesting that the more you actually dig about in newspaper archives, the more you find first-hand accounts written by these people or reported by these people, these camp followers. And sometimes you wonder if the reason why these are not more widely known is just that they haven't really been deemed to be of great enough importance for people to actually research. So there's far more out there than perhaps we've realised in the past. And I just wonder if that sort of comes back to how the wives and partners of these ordinary soldiers and where they sat in society, and if it was a respected position. Like we have some first-hand accounts of Waterloo, especially, that are quite well known by higher status women. And now we know that there are more and more accounts than perhaps people originally realised by these ordinary women as well. And do you think that sort of feeds into how the camp followers were perceived in society in general, the reason why we may not know that many of their stories?
Yes, definitely, Katie. I think that is true, that, you know, these women were sometimes admired, but they were also often regarded as the kind of worst form of femininity, because the army was known as a pretty wild, profane, blasphemous environment, and not an appropriate place for respectable femininity, you know. So especially in the 18th century and the 19th century, there was this growing sense that this was no place for a woman who had any, you know, was deserving of any respect. And I think that has helped. You know, their reputation was kind of wild, drunken, profane, promiscuous, And it's in part because the officers as well were pretty wild. And so, you know, women being in that kind of environment where there's no control over the behavior of the men in those areas of, you know, their sexuality and their religiosity and things like that, I think that made it more, you know, there was some discomfort with the idea of good women being in that kind of environment. But it's very complicated, because I would also say that there was some admiration for these women for surviving that kind of rough environment. And there's heroic stories of them, as I said, about, you know, their maternity, their maternal devotion, and their bravery, because sometimes they actually had a role in the campaign. And so there's kind of mixed attitudes. And maybe even that plays into why their stories weren't too widely known. It continues to be a puzzling question, but it's also very exciting to be discovering more and more materials now.
Yeah, I mean, I find this a fascinating, probably the most fascinating question, because especially when we're looking at the Battle of Waterloo, it's up there in British history as one of the formative battles representative of the national character, you know, Agincourt, Trafalgar, the Battle of Britain, Waterloo. And when you bring in questions of the lives and fates and the statuses of camp followers, can be seen as maybe muddying the waters. There are a lot of people who are reluctant to actually look at the granular and contradictory and shocking aspects of this, because especially in the current moment, there's a lot of, I'd imagine there's a lot of serious backlash against bringing in these sets of records, doing research around these subjects, because they will contradict the narrative of how certain parts of British national character are put together, these specific military events, the way in which they're glorified and presented and clung to. But I think it's really exciting. It's a really good and important question now more than ever.
There's an extension to that point, really, with your research as well, that bringing a more diverse kind of understanding to what these periods were like, and who you would have seen and who was involved in all of these big events that, as you've said, are such a part of the national character. Yeah. But
more so, I don't want to go into cliche, but I can't avoid it. It's also pushes us to consider, you know, who do we think we are, all of us? Why do we hold these stories in the way they've been presented, or even the way we wish to examine them? Why do we take these approaches? What does it say about us, the society we live in? Whose stories are they anyway? And that's, you know, the bigger battle. You know, it's greater than all the Waterloos and Cressys and Agincourts combined.
I think really as a final point to draw together what we've just been talking about, what we're really emphasizing is the fact that we as people today make history, and as we do history as a process, and our decisions today make a huge impact on the stories that both we choose to tell and we in the past definitely have chosen not to.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well, this idea of pushback against the telling of more stories. I would personally say that having more information about an event or a historical period rather than less information is better. Like, it's better and more interesting to hear a wider range of stories.